In the first video of this series, I explained how one can adopt broadly three positions with respect to the mind-body problem: physicalism, dualism, or idealism. I then spent the next several videos extensively arguing against physicalism and in favor of substance dualism. We examined several reasons for believing that the mind is not a physical entity. However, I am well aware that there is a certain segment of idealists within my audience who have patiently waited through this series and are now thinking, yes, you've established that the mind is immaterial, but that doesn't prove substance dualism because we idealists also believe that the mind is immaterial. In fact, we believe everything is immaterial. So why prefer substance dualism to idealism? This video is my attempt to answer that lingering question. Idealism is the metaphysical position that everything is mental or that all is mind. It can be thought of as the polar opposite of materialism. Whereas materialism says that everything is comprised of matter and that nothing immaterial exists, idealism goes in the other direction, saying that everything is immaterial and that nothing material exists. As John Heil says, idealists reject the materialist side of the dualist picture. All that exists, they contend, are minds and their contents. Idealists do not simply deny that external material objects exist. They contend that an external material world is literally unthinkable. The thesis that objects exist outside the mind is judged not false, but unintelligible. Substance dualists like myself are between these two extremes and wish to affirm both that there are material and immaterial entities. The idealist tradition was popularized by George Berkeley in the 18th century and became one of the major theories on offer during that time. But with the advances of modern science in the early 20th century, the popularity of idealism began to wane. Today, it is defended by a small but vocal minority of philosophers like Bernardo Kastrup and John Foster. I wouldn't even address it were it not for the fact that various influential Christian YouTubers, such as Inspiring Philosophy, Christian Idealism, and Invoking Theism, promote idealism and have convinced many Christian apologists who are active on YouTube of idealism. Since that is the bulk of my audience, I would be remiss if I did not at least offer something in the way of a reason to prefer substance dualism to idealism. There are, of course, a variety of arguments for idealism. I don't want to get too bogged down here, but I should probably say something about them. In my experience, there are broadly two types of idealists. There are those who favor purely philosophical arguments for idealism, and those who favor empirical or scientific arguments for idealism. The most famous example of the former type of idealist would be George Berkeley himself. He notoriously offered what has been called the master argument for idealism. It is supposed to show that the notion of mind-independent objects is unintelligible. As Berkeley put it, I am content to put the whole upon this issue. If you can but conceive it possible for one extended movable substance, or in general, for any one idea, or anything like an idea, to exist otherwise than in a mind perceiving it, I shall readily give up the cause. But you say, surely there is nothing easier than to imagine trees, for instance, in a park, or books existing in a closet, and nobody by to perceive them. I answer, you may so, there is no difficulty in it. But what is all this, I beseech you, more than framing in your mind certain ideas which you call books and trees, and at the same time omitting to frame the idea of any one that may perceive them? But do not you yourself perceive or think of them all the while? This, therefore, is nothing to the purpose. It only shows you have the power of imagining or forming ideas in your mind, but it doth not show that you can conceive it possible the objects of your thought may exist without the mind. To make out this, it is necessary that you conceive them existing unconceived or unthought of, which is a manifest repugnancy. When we do our utmost to conceive the existence of external bodies, we are, all the while, only contemplating our own ideas. But the mind, taking no notice of itself, is deluded to think it can, and doth conceive bodies existing unthought of, or without the mind, though, at the same time, they are apprehended by, or exist, in itself. So the idea is that we cannot actually conceive of mind-independent objects, because in order to conceive of them, we would have to be conceiving. Berkeley's argument surely seems vulnerable to the criticism that it conflates representation with what is represented. Berkeley seems to be confusing what it is that we conceive with the things we are conceiving of. In other words, thoughts can be about things beyond themselves. So even if I must have a thought to think about a mind-independent object, it doesn't follow that the thought can only be about itself or about other thoughts. As Ali Hasan observes, it is of course true that I cannot conceive of some possible object, like a tree, without having an idea that is about it or that represents it. In that sense, I cannot conceive of something that is in fact not conceived by me, but that is trivial. How is that supposed to show that it is incoherent to think of the possibility that a tree exists without someone's having an idea about it? In thinking about this possibility, I am having an idea of a tree, but my having an idea of a tree is not part of what I am thinking about. In fact, I am thinking about the possibility that there is a tree that is not conceived of by anyone, that there is no idea anyone has of it. That is the sort of possibility that my idea is about, and that idea has not been shown to be incoherent or contradictory. The argument will be tempting only if one does not distinguish carefully between the mental representation and what it represents or is about, between that which we conceive with and that which we conceive of. There are, of course, more modern and updated defenses of Berkeley's argument. Probably the best modern reconstruction I have come across is the major argument of John Foster's excellent book, The Case for Idealism. Foster's argument is highly technical and probably deserves a video all its own to be adequately assessed. But for the sake of keeping this video manageable, I'll move on with the observation that most online idealists that make this argument, in my experience, are making arguments much more like Berkeley's than Foster's. And I think that what I have said is sufficient to overcome Berkeley's argument. Turning now to the other type of idealist, the arguments from this camp purport to be scientific. Modern advances in the study of quantum mechanics are supposed to support the truth of idealism. In particular, the double-slit experiment and the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment feature prominently in such arguments. As Inspiring Philosophy explains,
discoveries and equations formulated to explain the bizarre quantum world began to baffle physicists. The universe did not seem to be fundamentally deterministic at the bottom level, but probabilistic. The mathematics essentially described that particles would exist in a state of a wave function, which is nothing more than a mathematical probability of multiple possible states of where the particle could be. But upon measurement from an observer, the wave function would collapse to one position. But that implied outside observers were necessary to collapse the wave function and bring about the physical existence of the fundamental particles that make up reality, which many scientists philosophically could not accept. How could outside observers be responsible for the actual result and the collapse of the particle, instead of us simply observing nature to see how it behaves on its own? How could the most fundamental particles of nature be dependent on our observations, instead of just acting independently? The famous double-slit experiment reveals how odd the rules of quantum mechanics are. Physicists were interested if particles acted like waves or little balls of matter. Using a single-slit and double-slit experiment, we can determine how they behave. For comparison, when balls are shot through a single slit, they would create a single band on the other side where they land. And when they are shot through a double slit, they would reveal two bands on the other side. However, when a wave goes through a single slit, it would reveal a wave-like pattern with intensity in the middle. And when several waves go through a double slit, they interfere with each other, creating an interference pattern. So shooting particles through a double slit should reveal if they act like waves or particles. In various double slit experiments, particles were fired through a single slit, and the results revealed that particles were acting like waves. The particles go through both slits, and the wave-like properties interfere with each other, causing an interference pattern. However, something strange happened when we tried to shoot one particle at a time. This way, multiple particles with wave-like properties cannot interfere with each other. Even so, when one particle was fired at a time, we still observed an interference pattern. The interesting thing that is happening is each particle is arriving at a specific spot on the back screen, meaning they seem to be acting like little bits of matter, not as waves of energy. However, after several particles are fired individually, an interference pattern starts to emerge. But how could that be if they are going through individually and not interfering with each other? The conclusion was reached. Each particle goes through not as a wave of energy, but as a wave of potentialities. A wave of all the possible paths it could take, interferes with itself, knowing which are the most likely landing spots and which are the least likely, and then collapses to one definite position once it is observed on the back film. In other words, all the possible paths exist simultaneously in a mathematical sense until the particle collapses to one location and it's observed on the back film. So physicists attempted to figure out what was happening at the double slit. They placed a measuring device there, but when they did this, the particles changed how they behaved and acted like tiny balls, revealing a pattern of two bands. The very act of observing at the slit, or having knowledge of the path the particles took, caused them to behave differently. What we chose to measure, whether to check to find out which slit they went through, or check to see which pattern they formed on the back film, determines the way the particles act and behave. Thus, physicists inferred nothing was physically certain until an observer made a measurement. These implications show consciousness is not a product of physical interactions in the brain, because if it was, it would also need to be collapsed as well. But the evidence implies the need for something not bound by the same laws of quantum mechanics, which can cause the ultimate collapse for all of matter. Otherwise, there is no logical explanation for what causes collapse in the existence of matter. So if experiments show an observer is needed to cause collapse, and all of matter is bound by these same rules, then the most logical inference is consciousness is ultimately and philosophically the cause of the collapse of the wave function, and the physical existence of matter itself. Quantum mechanics, the very fundamental nature of reality, leads us to the idea consciousness is not physical and is more real than matter itself. The evidence infers there is no escape. We have to face the reality that the physical makeup of space-time is dependent on conscious observers. As Eugene Wigner said, the laws of quantum mechanics cannot be formulated without recourse to the concept of consciousness. Henry Stapp says, the solution hinges not on quantum randomness, but rather on the dynamical effects within quantum theory of the intention and attention of the observer. Stephen Barr says, human beings are observers, and perhaps the only observers. This fact clearly has potentially huge implications for the question of whether the human mind is entirely reducible to physics and mathematics. The very fundamental nature of matter implies consciousness is not a product of it, but that the opposite is true. Physical matter is a product of consciousness, thus leading to an idealistic or dualistic approach to reality. The physical universe is a product of mind, and the very fundamental pieces of reality require an observer. The old view of materialism is inadequate in fitting the data. There are simply no hidden variables and no interpretation of quantum mechanics that cannot account for the data without being ad hoc. Reality is dependent on conscious observers. As Nobel Prize winner Eugene Wigner said, while a number of philosophical ideas may be logically consistent with present quantum mechanics, materialism is not.
Now, up front, I will fully admit to not being terribly familiar with the science of quantum mechanics, but I do have an inherent skepticism about trying to draw any firm metaphysical conclusions about the fundamental nature of reality from scientific evidence, and this is especially so when it comes to a field of study as uncertain, experimental, and controversial as quantum mechanics. It surely seems to me that arguments for idealism based upon experiments in quantum mechanics are entirely dependent upon a particular interpretation of the results of those experiments, known as the Copenhagen interpretation. That interpretation, although popular, is by no means required. Indeed, arguably one needs an overarching metaphysical theory of the world in order to even draw any interpretation from these experiments at all. And if that is right, then one certainly cannot draw any conclusions about the truth of idealism from these experiments. Those more knowledgeable in this area than myself agree with this basic assessment. For example, Ivan the Heathen explains,
the first point that I want to make is just the basic point in philosophy of science that theory is underdetermined by evidence. All this really means is that for any given collection of observation statements that a scientific theory is constructed to account for, it is always possible to construct more than one scientific theory which accounts equally well for all of the observation statements in the set. For any set of observations, you can construct at least two, and in fact probably an infinite number of theories, which make different starting assumptions, but which account for all of the facts that you'd like to account for. And if you expand the set of observation statements, you may rule out some of the theories that previously couldn't be ruled out, but you'd never be able to narrow it down just to one theory. So theory is always underdetermined by evidence. No set of observation statements, however large, can ever narrow things down to the point where just one scientific theory and only one scientific theory can account for the evidence in question. Now, the second point I want to make ties in with the first point, and that is that because in science theory is underdetermined by evidence, the only way in which one can distinguish between alternative scientific theories, which all equally account for the same set of observation statements, is by the initial metaphysical assumptions made by those theories. Now, they don't always have to be metaphysical assumptions, but generally they are, and they are assumptions of some sort. The theories can only be distinguished by reference to those things. And this leads to an important point. Scientific theories can make background assumptions which are false, but if one can go from those false assumptions to the construction of a theoretical model which nevertheless is able to account for the observations that one has to account for, that scientific theory is adequate. Even though its assumptions may be true or false or what have you, there's no ontological commitment to the truth of those assumptions. And what all of that means is that with any scientific theory whatsoever, one must come at the theory with a framework of philosophical and metaphysical background assumptions which frame how one is to interpret the observations that one has to collate together and explain within the scientific theory that one's proposing. So, every scientific theory has certain background metaphysical assumptions, and those metaphysical assumptions describe and set limits to how one can interpret and understand the data that one gathers from observations. Those data, together with those metaphysical assumptions, give you limits as to, or parameters, as to what your theoretical models can look like in your scientific theories. Okay? And scientific theories are always going to be limited by those background assumptions. Now, most physicists and most scientists in general really make certain philosophical and metaphysical assumptions unconsciously or without realizing it. And I think that this was the case with Heisenberg and Bohr. They make certain assumptions about metaphysics, don't realize that they're doing it, and they thereby unwittingly set up parameters to the interpretation of their physical data that constrain what their theories can look like. And as often happens, they're not going to be very attentive to those background philosophical assumptions that they're making. And when they're not attentive to these things, they will often make the mistake of claiming that their scientific work refutes or at least or argues for or poses objections against some metaphysical or ontological thesis or other. And this is a mistake. So, having made this point, that all scientific theories can only be and must necessarily be formulated within the framework of certain metaphysical assumptions, whether implicit or explicit, what does this have to do with quantum mechanics? Well, Bohr and Heisenberg made two assumptions about how to interpret quantum theory and the results of things like the double slit experiment. And metaphysically speaking, these two assumptions are absolute whoppers. And not only are they absolute whoppers, but it is completely impossible, even in principle, to justify them using physics alone. And the assumptions are as follows. Assumption number one is that the mathematical description of particles as existing in a superposition probability distribution prior to observation actually refers to a real phenomenon. There is no justification whatsoever within quantum mechanics for that claim. None. There is no reason to take the mathematical apparatus that Heisenberg and Bohr devised and claim that the structures proposed by that apparatus refer to anything in reality. That is just something that they assumed. Now, remember the earlier point that I made, that scientific theories need not always make realistic initial assumptions. The only things that they need to do is to generate correct predictions. Now, the mathematical description of unobserved objects existing in a joint superposition enables one to correctly predict the behavior of objects in all sorts of quantum mechanical experiments. But that does not imply that the mathematical description of objects in a statistical superposition, once they are unobserved, refers to the actual state of those objects when they in fact are unobserved. This is a simple reification error. They're taking a mathematical construct which was designed simply to produce a useful model which can generate accurate predictions, and they're imputing ontological status to it in a way that is completely unjustified. And it is completely unjustified because quantum mechanics itself cannot provide the justification for doing this. That assumption, in fact, is one of the background philosophical assumptions of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which enables that interpretation to even be able to make sense out of any experimental data. The other assumption is also a whopper, and that assumption is that if an object does not have definite ascertainable, does not have properties which are definitely ascertainable and measurable, that is, if the properties of an object are not such as can be precisely measured and determined, then that object doesn't have those properties and therefore doesn't exist. That's a whopper of an assumption. And it's a blatant foray into metaphysics. The only way to give an argument for that claim is to provide a philosophical argument for it. You can't do this with physics alone. That's very important to understand. I hope that's clear. And the final point that I want to make is that if you take those two assumptions and you conjoin them together, you get something that's rather shocking. So take the assumption number one says that when objects are not observed, they actually do exist in a joint mathematical superposition such that none of their quantum properties are precisely ascertainable. And assumption two says that if the quantum properties of some particle are not precisely ascertainable, then that particle doesn't exist. Now, if you conjoin those two assumptions, you get the proposition that a particle which is not being observed or measured does not exist. That's idealism. Okay? That is the central claim of idealism. That all of those things in reality, or what we take to be reality, which are not being consciously perceived or measured, if you like, by some mind, do not exist. That which is not perceived does not exist. That is idealism. Those two background assumptions, which frame the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, when combined, entail idealism. And so what that means is that the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics doesn't prove idealism, it presupposes it. It presupposes idealism and then interprets the data of quantum mechanical experiments within that context, within that philosophical and metaphysical context. But commenters like Johann Ratz or Inspiring Philosophy or any of 1,000 other pseudo-mystics or pop science commentators have not been sufficiently attentive to things like philosophical premises and so on, and a lot of physicists have been complicit in this as well, that they have made the mistake of thinking that the interpretive framework for quantum mechanics is metaphysically neutral, and that when they examine its results and interpret it and provide theories for it, that all of that is metaphysically neutral, that it has no preset metaphysical commitments, and they think that these results, that these metaphysical conclusions, a metaphysical conclusion like idealism, just purely follows from the quantum mechanical results. No, the quantum mechanical results are interpreted within an idealistic framework because the two assumptions of the Copenhagen interpretation that I mentioned entail idealism. And they entail idealism without even having to go into a discussion of the physics. And so it's no surprise that people who subscribe to the Copenhagen interpretation are pushed into saying things like that the conscious observer plays a fundamental role in the collapse of the wave function. All that conclusion is baked into the background assumptions of the Copenhagen interpretation, which are present before you even start doing experiments. So it's no surprise that that's arrived at. So what I would say is that quantum mechanics doesn't prove idealism, it presupposes it.
In the previous section, I briefly surveyed two popular arguments for idealism and showed that neither of them succeed in establishing the truth of idealism. But now I want to explore the main reason why I am not an idealist. Earlier we saw that there are different varieties of idealism. Most contemporary idealists are not of the subjective, solipsistic sort. They do affirm the existence of a reality outside of one's own personal consciousness. They just maintain that the external world is itself constituted by consciousness. And in the case of theistic idealists, the world is constituted by God's consciousness. In this way, they attempt to maintain a distinction between the stuff in our minds and the stuff out there. As John Foster explains, it is almost inevitable that the idealist will see the sensory organization as imposed on human subjects by something outside the sensory realm, and indeed outside the realm of human mentality altogether. In other words, he will suppose that there is some form of external reality, a reality which is separate from and logically independent of the realm of human mentality, which causally controls the course of human sensory experience, and whose modes of control form the sensory organization. In this respect, the idealist will find himself in agreement with the realist, who also accepts that there is an external reality which plays this causal role. But whereas the realist equates this reality with the physical world, the idealist takes it to be something which underlies the physical world, something which sustains the constraints on experience by which, wholly or in part, the physical world is created. I will call this version of idealism dual aspect idealism. It is my view that this is the only plausible sort of idealism. My central objection to it is that, by adopting a duality of aspects, this sort of idealism is rendered virtually identical to substance dualism. For substance dualists, one of the defining features of mental entities is their essentially private nature. By this, I mean that mental entities, such as ideas, thoughts, emotions, sensory impressions, and so on, belong essentially to a single individual and can only be accessed directly by the individual to whom they belong. So, for example, if I have the thought that blue is my favorite color, I am able to ascertain this fact directly by introspection. I don't need to undergo any sort of investigation to learn this. Furthermore, I am the only one who can know this fact in this direct sort of way. Other people might be able to infer this from the sort of car I drive or the clothes I wear, or perhaps they can learn it from me simply telling them that blue is my favorite color. But the thought itself is only directly accessible to me. Physical or material facts, by contrast, are the sorts of things which are, or at least can be, public. They can be accessed by many different individuals. For example, the precise contours of Mount Rushmore can impress themselves upon an entire crowd of people at the same time and in approximately the same way. These contours do not belong to any one person in a crowd of people looking at Mount Rushmore. They are publicly accessible to everyone. In this way, for the substance dualist, physical objects are very different from mental objects. As E.J. Lowe puts it, by a public object, I mean one that can be perceived by more than one person, so that this class includes not only material objects such as tables and trees, but also what we might call phenomenal objects such as rainbows, reflections, and shadows. By a private object, I mean one that can be perceived directly by only one person. This distinction between publicly available and privately accessible facts not only appears quite obvious on its face, but it is likewise critical to preserving the idea that certain thoughts and ideas belong to particular individuals. If ideas are not really private entities, but are actually as public as any other physical fact, then it becomes unclear in what sense they belong exclusively to just one person. What makes it the case that my ideas are really mine, if not the fact that I alone have direct and unmediated access to them? If other agents could access ideas in the same way that I can, what distinguishes any particular idea as being uniquely mine? As Brandon Rickabaugh and J.P. Moreland argue, notice that even if you could access the contents of my phenomenal state, it would not follow that you share my mental state. Suppose that you've studied my brain to the degree that you can, with a high rate of accuracy, recognize that I am recalling a memory. You would have access to facts about the content of my mental state, that it is a memory. Still, you would not have access to the perspectival content of my phenomenal state. You would not stand in the ontological relation of self-presentation between me and my mental state. Therefore, privacy is true. Now, the dual aspect idealist wants to preserve this distinction. They want to maintain that my own ideas and perceptions and the like are private to myself, whereas Mount Rushmore and other external objects are public. Nevertheless, they also wish to claim that these external objects are still mental entities. The issue, though, is that it's no longer clear what the defining characteristics of a mental entity are if publicly available facts, which can be equally accessed by different minds, are allowed to qualify. The substance dualist is able to clearly demarcate between mental and physical objects by appealing to their private or public statuses, respectively. As Katalin Farkas puts it, my proposal is that the mental realm is nothing but the subject matter of the cognitive capacity that endows me with special access, that is, the area that is known by me in a way that is known by no one else. But the dual aspect idealist wants to say that mental entities are capable of being either public or private. If that is how things are, then the word mental appears to have lost any substantive meaning. It's just become a label for anything that exists. So the substance dualist and the dual aspect idealist are in agreement that there are these two types of entities which behave differently. Some are public in the sense of being equally accessible to multiple parties, and some are private in the sense of being directly accessible to just one individual. The dualist labels the private entities as mental. The dual aspect idealist agrees, but wants to also label the public entities as mental. However, in doing this, they strip mentality of the very properties which would make it mental in the view of the dualist. This seems to lead us to the conclusion, then, that the disagreement between the dualist and the dual aspect idealist is merely semantic and not substantive. They are both in agreement regarding the sorts of entities which exist. Furthermore, they are both in agreement on the way in which these sorts of entities behave. They both agree that the stuff in our heads acts differently than the stuff we encounter in the world. The only disagreement regards if those public entities should carry the label mental. If the substance dualist conception of mentality is adopted, then it is trivially true that public entities cannot be mental entities, and it's not clear that the dual aspect idealist has a better definition of mentality on offer. But even if they do, the point remains that this reduces to a mere semantic disagreement between the substance dualist and the dual aspect idealist. Consequently, my fundamental reason for not being an idealist is that what I regard as the most plausible type of idealism, that is, dual aspect idealism, cannot be substantively distinguished from the very sort of substance dualism which I already embrace. We are agreed upon the existence of public and private entities, and merely disagree about how widely to apply the label mental. I end up in the dualist camp because the dualist seems to have a clear and well-motivated understanding of the mental, which he restricts to just those private entities. The idealist, by contrast, just introduces needless confusion by insisting that public entities are also mental entities, despite behaving very differently than private entities. This video has explored metaphysical idealism. I have tried to give a clear and fair analysis of idealism. I have considered and rejected the major arguments which have been used to support idealism. Finally, I have argued that the only plausible version of idealism cannot meaningfully distinguish itself from substance dualism, and ends up merely being in semantic disagreement with substance dualism. For these reasons, I count myself a substance dualist rather than an idealist.